The brass bell above the staff door at the Chamberlain Hotel rang exactly 7 times before 6 in the morning, and on that particular day, it rang an 8th time just for me. Because I was running late, and the manager liked to remind everyone that lateness was a personal insult to him. My name is Anthony Price, and at 5 months pregnant, my knees had started complaining about the marble floors long before my body did anything else. I worked in the smallest, least glamorous room of that enormous hotel, a narrow closet beside the lobby where I polished the shoes of men who would never remember my face. It suited me. I did not want to be remembered. I wanted, more than anything, to disappear quietly into a life that had nothing to do with the one I'd left behind. I rubbed polish into a pair of Oxfords that morning with the kind of focus only a person running from memory could manage. My hands knew the motion without needing my mind present for it. Small circles, gentle pressure, a cloth folded just so. It let my thoughts wander, which was usually a mistake, because my thoughts only ever wandered to one place. They wandered to Jack Norton. I hadn't said his name out loud in months. Saying a name gives it weight, gives it permission to walk back into a room it was asked to leave. But that morning, the hotel had been humming with a particular kind of energy since the day before. Florists tracking petals across the marble string quartets tuning in the ballroom. A wedding planner barking orders into a headset like she was commanding a small war. I'd asked one of the bellhops what all the fuss was for, more out of habit than curiosity. "Big wedding," he said, not even looking up from the cart he was loading. "Norton family, you know, the shipping Nortons. Whole East Wings booked for the families alone." My hands stopped moving. I told myself there were 100 Norton families in this city, that shipping money ran thick through every neighborhood with a view of the harbor. That the universe did not organize its cruelties so neatly as to drop my Jack's wedding into the very hotel where I scrubbed strangers' leather for tit money. I told myself this while my heart did something complicated and painful in my chest, something that felt like hope trying to climb out of a grave I'd dug for it myself. I went back to polishing. The Oxfords gleamed. I did not allow myself to think further than that, because thinking further meant remembering the weight of Jack's hand on the small of my back, the low rumble of his laugh against my ear, the particular way he used to say my name like it was something precious he'd been allowed to borrow. My little room smelled of leather and wax and the faint chemical sweetness of polish, and most days I found that smell comforting in its plainness. There was nothing complicated about a scuffed shoe. You could fix it with patience and the right cloth, and when you were finished, the proof of your work sat there gleaming, undeniable, uncomplicated by feeling. I had built an entire life around that kind of uncomplicated work in the 2 years since I'd left everything else behind, and most days it was enough. That morning, it wasn't. I set the Oxfords aside and pressed both hands flat against the small of my back, easing a dull ache that had become a familiar companion in the last few weeks. The baby shifted, a slow roll beneath my ribs, and I found myself murmuring the way I often did when we were alone together. Soft nonsense meant only to soothe. "Don't worry," I told them, resting my hand over the curve of my stomach. "Whatever's happening out there today has nothing to do with us." I almost believed it. I had gotten good, in 2 years, at believing things I needed to believe in order to keep moving through a day. I believed that the ache in my chest, whenever I thought of Jack, was simply old grief settling, the way a bruise eventually fades to something you only notice when you press on it directly. I believed that the life I'd built, small, quiet, careful, was enough, was even good, because it was mine, and no one could take it from me the way Harlan Norton had once threatened to take everything else. I believed, mostly, that I had made peace with losing him. It is strange, the things we manage to convince ourselves of, right up until the moment reality walks past us in a hallway and proves every careful belief a lie. I met Jack Norton 2 years before any of this, at a dinner I wasn't supposed to be at. I was an Omega from a family with more pride than money, and the kind of formal events that families like the Nortons attended were not events families like mine were invited to. I'd gone that night as a server, hired through an agency for the evening, dressed in a black vest that didn't fit quite right and shoes that pinched. I remember setting down a tray of champagne flutes at a table full of important people who didn't look at me, the way important people rarely look at the help. Except one of them did. He was seated at the far end, half turned away from his own conversation, and when I glanced up, he was already watching me with an expression I didn't have a name for yet. Alphas didn't usually look at omegas like that in rooms full of money. Appraising, maybe, or dismissive, but rarely curious. Jack looked at me like I was the only interesting thing in a room full of chandeliers. "You're new," he said, when I came back around with the second course, not a question. He had a way of saying things like he already knew the answer and just wanted to hear me confirm it. "Hired for the night," I told him, because it was true and because something about the warmth in his voice made lying feel impossible. "Lucky for me," he said, and smiled in a way that made my pulse do something unprofessional. I should have walked away. I should have remembered my place. The careful, invisible line that kept people like me separate from people like him. Instead, I found myself slipping him a real answer when he asked my name, found myself lingering a half-second too long at his table, found myself 3 hours later, standing in the hotel garden with him while the party wound down inside his jacket draped over my shoulders, because the night had turned cold and he'd noticed before I had. "I don't usually do this," he admitted, looking out at the dark hedges instead of at me, which somehow made the confession feel more honest. "Talk to people at these things. Most of them want something from my family name. You didn't even know who I was until someone said it." "I still don't really know who you are," I said. "I know you tip generously and you don't like the salmon." He laughed, surprised out of him, and the sound of it settled somewhere warm in my chest. "Jack Norton," he said, holding out his hand like we were meeting for the first time, which, in a way, we were. "Heir to a shipping company. I have very mixed feelings about, occasional disappointment to my father, and apparently someone who falls for caterers in gardens." "Anthony Price," I answered, shaking his hand and feeling something between us settle into place, quiet and certain, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting a long time to be opened. We didn't fall in love that night. But the seed was planted, and over the following weeks, Jack found reasons to be wherever I was. The coffee shop near the agency office, the small park I cut through on my way to work. Eventually, my own apartment door holding takeout, and an apology for showing up unannounced that neither of us really meant. By the time 6 months had passed, I had stopped imagining a life that didn't include him in it. I remember the night he first told his friends about me because I wasn't there for it, and he called me afterward sounding both proud and nervous in equal measure. The way people sound when they finally said something out loud that they'd been carrying privately for a long time. "I told them," he said, before I'd even finished saying hello, "about us, about you, and Marcus asked if you were the caterer he'd heard about, and I said yes, and then I told him you were the most important person in my life, and the table went very quiet for a second. And then everyone just sort of accepted it." He laughed, a little breathless. I think I was more scared of that conversation than I've been of anything in years. "Why?" I asked, though some part of me already understood the answer. "Because once I say it out loud to people who matter, it's real," he said. "And once it's real, I can't pretend anymore that I haven't already decided you're the person I want to spend my life with." I had to sit down on the edge of my bed when he said that, my heart doing something complicated and overwhelmed, because no one had ever spoken about a future with me like it was already decided, already certain, already theirs to claim and mine to share. There were good months after that, more than I sometimes let myself remember, because remembering the good months made the ending hurt sharper by comparison. There was a weekend at a lake house belonging to one of his cousins, where we spent 3 days doing nothing but reading on a dock and falling asleep tangled together under a quilt that smelled like cedar. There was the morning he showed up at my apartment with a key cut for my door, sliding it across the counter without ceremony, like it was the most natural thing in the world for him to want a permanent way into my life. There was the night, 8 months into knowing each other, when he said the words first, unprompted, his voice rough with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "I love you," he told me, in the dark, his hand resting over my heart like he wanted to feel the words land. I don't say that easily. I've never said it to anyone before you. But I love you, Anthony, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise just because it complicates things with my family. I love you too, I told him, and meant it more completely than I had ever meant anything. We didn't know then how heavily that complication would eventually weigh, how much Harlan Norton's idea of an acceptable future would come to cost us both. In those early months, love still felt like enough on its own, a force capable of outlasting anything two stubborn, frightened families could throw at it. I think, in some essential way, it always was enough. It simply took us 2 painful years apart to prove it. That morning at the hotel, I tried to bury that memory the way I'd buried so many others, but the wedding preparations made burying anything impossible. By midday, the lobby had filled with guests in pale linen and sharp suits, the air thick with expensive perfume, and the particular nervous joy of people about to watch 2 lives merge into one. I kept my head down. I had 3 more pairs of shoes waiting in my little room dropped off by guests who wanted to look their best for photographs, and I told myself that if I just focused on the work, the day would pass like any other. It was the 4th pair that undid me. They came in with a note clipped to the laces. Norton J. needed by 3 p.m. Ceremony starts at 4. My hands recognized the shoes before my mind caught up. A particular wear pattern on the left heel, a small scuff near the toe that I remembered noticing once years ago. When I'd teased Jack about needing new shoes, and he'd told me these were his lucky pair bought the week he met me, and he wasn't replacing them for anyone. I sat very still for a long moment with his shoes in my lap, the polished cloth forgotten in my hand, my baby shifting inside me as though even they could feel the way the room had tilted sideways. I want to say I had some grand realization in that moment, some clean and simple truth that resolved everything. I didn't. I had a tangle of feelings so thick I couldn't separate one from another. Grief, anger, a love I'd told myself was long dead, suddenly proving very much alive, and underneath all of it, a fierce, protective fear for the small life curled inside me, a life Jack didn't know existed. I polished his shoes anyway. My hands moved through the motion out of habit, out of some stubborn refusal to let this day break me in front of strangers. By the time I finished, they gleamed brighter than anything else I'd touched all week, and I hated myself a little for the care I'd put into it. The hours between finishing those shoes and the wedding itself stretched out endlessly, each minute thick with the dread I couldn't quite explain to myself. I delivered the shoes to the front desk for collection, careful to avoid the east wing where I knew the groom's suite was located, and tried to bury myself in the rest of the morning's work. It didn't help. Every guest who passed through the lobby seemed to be discussing some detail of the ceremony. The floral arrangements imported specially for the occasion, the string quartet flown in from 2 cities over. The sheer scale of a wedding meant to announce a merger as much as a marriage. I caught a glimpse of the bride once through the open doors of the bridal suite as a maid hurried past with an armful of garment bags, a beautiful woman with dark hair pinned elegantly back, sitting very still while a makeup artist worked around her, her expression unreadable from the distance I stood at. I wondered, not unkindly, whether she loved him. I wondered whether she knew the way I had once known exactly what it felt like to be chosen by Jack Norton, fully, completely, without reservation, and I felt a strange, complicated grief on her behalf, imagining she might be about to marry a man whose heart had already been claimed by someone else entirely, whether he admitted it to himself or not. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself I had no right to feel anything about a wedding that had nothing to do with me, that the most dignified thing I could do was finish my shift quietly and go home to the small, careful life I'd built the way I'd done every day for 2 years. But my hands shook anyway, every time I picked up a fresh pair of shoes, every time I caught another fragment of wedding chatter drifting through the lobby. My baby seemed to sense my unease, shifting restlessly beneath my ribs in a way that made it hard to catch a full breath. "I know," I murmured to them, pressing a hand briefly to my side between guests. "I know. We're almost done with today. Almost done." I didn't know yet how wrong I was about that. To understand how much that day cost me, you have to understand what we'd once had, before fear and money and a father's threats unraveled it. There is one memory I return to more than any other, even now, a small, ordinary evening that somehow holds more weight in my chest than any of our grander moments together. We were 8 months into knowing each other, curled together on the worn couch in my old apartment, the television playing something neither of us was really watching, his fingers absently tracing patterns along my forearm the way he did when his mind was somewhere else entirely. "What are you thinking about?" I'd asked, nudging him with my shoulder. "Houses," he admitted, a little sheepish, like the word embarrassed him somehow. "I drove past one today, this little place a few blocks from here, blue shutters, a garden that's clearly someone's pride and joy. I found myself imagining us there. Stupid, probably, this early." "Not stupid," I told him, my heart doing something warm and dangerous at the image he'd painted. "What were we doing in this little house with the blue shutters?" "Nothing important," he said, "making dinner badly, arguing about whose turn it was to walk whatever dog we'd inevitably adopt. Ordinary things. I think that's what got me, how ordinary it felt, imagining a life with you. Like it wasn't some grand fantasy, just something quiet and real that I actually wanted." I'd kissed him then, slow and certain, and we'd spent the rest of that evening lazily mapping out a future neither of us yet knew would be interrupted. Names for hypothetical pets. Arguments over paint colors for a house we didn't own, the particular shape of an ordinary happiness that felt in that moment entirely within reach. I think about that evening often, especially in the hardest months of my pregnancy, when loneliness pressed sharpest against my ribs. I think about how easily love can convince you that ordinary happiness is guaranteed, how thoroughly it can blind you to the fault lines already running beneath a relationship's foundation. We never got the house with the blue shutters. We never got the badly cooked dinners or the dog we couldn't agree on. But we got something else, eventually, harder won and more deeply tested, and I have come to believe that what survives a true test of love is worth infinitely more than what simply goes untested. The truth about why I left was both simpler and more complicated than anyone would believe. Jack's father had never approved of me. Harlan Norton was a man built entirely of ambition and old money, and to him, an Omega with no family fortune and no family name worth mentioning was an obstacle in the path of a merger he'd been engineering for years. A union between the Norton shipping empire and the Calloway family's logistics network, sealed not through contracts but through marriage. Jack had a fiancée before he ever had me. In his father's mind, at least, a woman named Celine Calloway, polished and pedigreed and entirely unaware in the early days that Jack's heart had already wandered somewhere else. Jack fought his father about it constantly. I remember the shouting matches I overheard through phone calls. He thought he'd muted the slammed doors the nights he showed up at my apartment with his jaw tight and his eyes red-rimmed, refusing to talk about it until I coaxed it out of him with tea and patience. "I won't marry her," he told me once, lying tangled with me in the dark, his hand resting protectively over my stomach, though neither of us knew yet what was growing there. "I don't care what it costs. I'm not losing you for a shipping contract." I believed him. God help me, I believed him completely. But belief is not the same as certainty, and certainty is what I needed when I discovered, 3 weeks after that conversation, that I was carrying his child. I needed to know that if I told him, his father's threats wouldn't suddenly outweigh his promises. I needed to know that the next time Harlan Norton sat his son down and laid out exactly what the Norton fortune would do to an Omega who threatened the family's plans, what lawyers could accomplish, what reputations could be destroyed, what a pregnant Omega without resources might find herself reduced to, Jack wouldn't flinch. I never got the chance to find out, because I overheard that exact conversation before I ever told him about the baby. It was a Sunday, I remember. Though I'd promised myself I wouldn't measure time by days of the week anymore after everything that followed, too many of my worst memories seemed to cluster around ordinary mornings that had no business turning into the days that reshaped a life. Jack had invited me to the Norton estate for what was meant to be a quiet lunch, just the two of us in the garden while his father was supposedly away at a board meeting that had run long. I'd arrived early, eager and nervous in the particular way new lovers are eager and nervous around each other's families. Carrying a small bouquet of flowers, I picked myself because I didn't yet understand that the Nortons considered homegrown gestures slightly beneath them. I was waiting outside Jack's father's study, intending to surprise him for lunch, when I heard Harlan's voice through the half-open door, low and merciless. If that boy gets himself attached to you in some legal sense, I will end you, Anthony. Quietly, thoroughly. You will not have a job, a home, or a single friend left in this city who will return your calls. Do you understand what I am capable of? I will not let some Omega from nothing unravel 40 years of work. I don't remember walking away from that door. I remember being 3 blocks from the Norton estate before my legs gave out beneath me, sitting on a curb with my hand pressed to a stomach that hadn't even begun to show yet, sobbing in a way that scared the few people who passed by. I never told Jack what I'd heard. I told myself it was because I didn't want to make him choose between his father and me. Didn't want to watch him try and fail to defy a man who had spent his whole life building walls that even love couldn't climb. But the truer answer, the one I only admitted to myself in the quietest, loneliest hours of my pregnancy, was that I was terrified Harlan was right. Terrified that if it came down to a choice, I would lose. And I would rather leave on my own terms than be discarded on someone else's. So I left. I packed 2 bags, took the small amount of savings I had, and disappeared into a part of the city where the Norton name meant nothing, where no one would think to look for an Omega who used to date a shipping heir. I found the job at the Chamberlain because the manager didn't ask too many questions, and the pay, modest as it was, kept a roof over my head. I never told Jack about the baby. I let him believe, if he believed anything at all, that I had simply stopped loving him. The months that followed were the hardest of my life, and I say that as someone who has since lived through labor pains and sleepless newborn nights and every other difficulty that came after. Nothing tested me quite like those first months alone, carrying a secret that grew heavier with every week that passed. I found out for certain at a clinic in a part of the city I'd never had reason to visit before, sitting in a plastic chair beside strangers who didn't know my name. Listening to a doctor explain dates and milestones in a voice that was kind but entirely unaware of the way her words were rearranging my entire life. I remember walking out into the afternoon light afterward and standing very still on the sidewalk, one hand pressed to my stomach, overwhelmed by a feeling I couldn't fully name, equal parts terror and a fierce, sudden love for someone I hadn't even met yet. I didn't have anyone to call with the news. My own family had grown distant after I left the agency work and disappeared from the social circles they'd hoped I might marry, into pride. It turned out traveled in both directions. And a son who'd loved and lost an alpha heir wasn't a son they particularly wanted to claim. I had a few friends from the catering agency, but none close enough to trust with something this fragile. So I carried the news alone, turning it over in my mind during long, quiet evenings in the small apartment I'd found, talking to a stomach that didn't yet show any sign of the life growing within it. The first time I felt them move, I was standing in the tiny kitchenette of that apartment, washing a single plate and a single mug, and the sensation was so unexpected, a small, deliberate flutter low in my belly, that I dropped the plate into the sink and stood frozen, my hand pressed flat against my own skin, crying in a way that had nothing to do with sadness at all. "Hello," I whispered, to no one and everyone. "Hello, you." I went to my prenatal appointments alone, sitting in waiting rooms full of couples holding hands, alphas with protective arms around Omega partners, and I told myself I didn't mind the empty chair beside me, even when the loneliness of it pressed sharp against my ribs. I learned to read ultrasound images by myself, learned to celebrate small milestones, a heartbeat strong and steady, a measurement that meant healthy growth, without anyone to share the relief with except the quiet apartment walls. There were nights I almost called him. I'd sit with my phone in my hand, His name pulled up on the screen, my thumb hovering over the call button, while my heart argued fiercely with my fear. But every time Harlan Norton's voice would surface in my memory, cold and certain, "I will end you, Anthony." Quietly, thoroughly. And I would set the phone down again, telling myself I was protecting all three of us. Even as some smaller, quieter part of me wondered if I was simply protecting myself from having to find out whether Jack's love could survive the test his father was so eager to administer. I built a life out of that loneliness, slowly, the way you build anything worth having, one small, deliberate choice at a time. I found the job at the Chamberlain when my old position with the catering agency became too physically demanding to continue. I found a midwife who didn't ask questions about the baby's father, who simply offered steady, competent care and the occasional kind word when she noticed how tired I looked. I found, eventually, a version of peace, fragile but real, built on the foundation of a love I'd never gotten to fully claim and a future I was determined to give my child regardless. I told myself it was enough. For 2 years, on most days, I even believed it. By 2:30, the hallway outside my small room had filled with members of the wedding party, all of them too important and too rushed to notice the pregnant Omega pressed against the wall trying to make himself small. I caught fragments of conversation as they passed. "The bride looks stunning. Have you seen the cake?" "Harlan's already 3 drinks in, and it's not even 4 o'clock." And each fragment landed like a small stone against my chest. I should have asked to leave early. I should have told my manager I felt unwell, which wasn't even a lie, and gone home to the small apartment where I'd built a careful, quiet life that didn't include any of this. Instead, some reckless, aching part of me wanted one more look at him. Just one. A debt I owed myself, maybe, or a wound I needed to press on to prove it could still hurt. I got my look sooner than I expected. Jack came around the corner from the groom's suite with his tie undone around his neck and his hair still slightly damp from a shower, laughing at something one of his groomsmen had said. And the sound of that laugh, that exact, unmistakable laugh I used to fall asleep listening to, hit me like a physical blow. He looked good. Older, somehow, in the 2 years since I'd seen him, though it had only been that long. There were faint lines near his eyes that hadn't been there before, and something in his expression that looked permanently tired in a way it never used to. But it was still him. Still the man whose hand I used to hold across cafe tables. Still the alpha whose scent I used to fall asleep wrapped in. He stopped laughing the moment his eyes found me. I watched the recognition hit him in stages. Confusion first, like his mind couldn't quite reconcile what his eyes were telling him. Then disbelief. And then something raw and unguarded that he didn't have time to hide before his groomsmen noticed him staring. "Anthony?" His voice cracked on my name in a way that undid 2 years of careful distance in a single syllable. I should have said something light, something deflecting, something that would let us both pretend this was a normal encounter between 2 people who used to know each other. Instead, I just stood there, one hand instinctively moving to rest over the curve of my stomach, and watched his eyes follow the motion. I watched him understand. "Give us a minute," Jack said to his groomsmen, his voice tight in a way I recognized from arguments with his father. Though this was the first time I'd ever heard it directed at someone trying to protect him from a difficult conversation rather than instigate one. They left, reluctantly, throwing curious glances over their shoulders. And then it was just the 2 of us in a hallway that suddenly felt far too small for everything that needed to be said. Jack started and stopped, his eyes dropping again to my stomach before snapping back up to my face like he was afraid of what he might find there. "Anthony, how far along?" 5 months, I said, because there was no version of this conversation where I could avoid the truth any longer. "A little over." I watched him do the math. I watched the exact moment the numbers landed, watched his face go through something complicated and devastating, somewhere between joy and grief and a fury that didn't seem aimed at me at all. 5 months, he repeated, quiet. "That's, Anthony, that means you were pregnant when you left." "I didn't know yet," I admitted. "Not when I made the decision to go. I found out 3 weeks before." And you didn't think to tell me? His voice wasn't angry, not exactly, but there was a wound in it that I recognized because I'd carried the same kind for 2 years. You were carrying my child, and you just disappeared and let me think you'd stopped loving me and never once considered that I might have wanted to know. I felt tears threatening, the hormonal kind that came faster and harder these days than they used to. And I hated that this conversation was happening in a hotel hallway an hour before he was supposed to marry someone else. Hated that I'd let myself believe one more look at him would be harmless. I heard your father, I said, the words coming out rougher than I intended. I heard exactly what he was prepared to do to me if I tried to hold any claim on you. And I believed him, Jack. I believed every word because I'd watched you fight him for months and never once win. Something in Jack's expression shattered. You should have told me, he said, his voice breaking properly now, no longer trying to hold itself together for an audience that wasn't there. Anthony, I would have left everything, the company, the name, all of it. I told you that. I meant it. You don't know that, I said, and immediately regretted the cruelty of it because his face crumpled like I'd struck him. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to hurt you. I was so scared, Jack. I was scared for myself and scared for the baby. And I didn't trust that love would be enough to protect either of us from a man like your father. He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was trying to find words equal to what he was feeling. And somewhere down the hall, a string quartet began warming up for the ceremony that was now less than an hour away. I'm getting married in 50 minutes, he said finally, the words sounding almost foreign in his own mouth, like he'd forgotten the wedding was happening at all in the wake of this conversation. I know, I said quietly. I saw your shoes. A broken, startled laugh escaped him, completely at odds with the gravity of everything else passing between us. You polished my shoes? I didn't know they were yours until I had them in my lap, I admitted. I recognized the scuff on the left toe before I read the name on the ticket. He looked down at his feet, at the shoes I'd shined that morning without knowing whose wedding I was preparing him for, and something in his face cracked open further. I never replaced them, he said softly. I told you once I never would. I remember, I said, and felt my voice waver dangerously. You said you'd wear them until they fell apart, and that even then you'd probably just have them resoled. I meant it. He took a step closer, slow and careful, like he was afraid sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile thing was forming between us in that hallway. Anthony, I've meant everything I ever told you. That's the part I can't get past right now. I told you I'd choose you over anything, my father threatened, and somehow you still ended up alone, carrying my child, polishing shoes in a hotel hallway, while I almost married someone else 1 floor away. How does that happen if I meant what I said? Because meaning something and being able to deliver on it aren't always the same thing, I told him, the words coming out rawer than I intended. I didn't doubt that you loved me, Jack. I doubted that love would survive contact with your father's lawyers and his money and everything he was willing to do to make sure his plans went through. I was terrified and pregnant and alone, and I made a choice out of that terror that I've spent 2 years questioning. You didn't have to be alone, he said, his voice cracking properly now. That's what kills me. Whatever you decided about my father, about the risk, you didn't have to carry it by yourself. I would have found a way. I would have figured out how to protect you, even if it meant losing everything else. I know that now, I said. I think some part of me even knew it then. But knowing and trusting aren't the same thing either, and I didn't have any trust left to spare for promises, not after I heard exactly what your father was prepared to do. He reached for my hand again, slower this time, watching my face for permission, and when I let him take it, his fingers wrapped around mine with a careful, desperate gentleness that undid something tightly wound in my chest. Tell me what to do, he said. Tell me how to fix 2 years in the next 50 minutes, because I am not walking down an aisle to marry someone else while you and our child stand in this hallway. I don't care how impossible that sounds. I don't have an answer for you, I admitted. I came here today to polish shoes, Jack, not to ask you to blow up your entire life. You didn't ask me to do anything, he said. I'm choosing it. There's a difference. I want to tell you that the rest of that hour passed easily, that Jack simply turned and called off the wedding the moment he learned the truth, that everything resolved as cleanly as it does in stories told for comfort rather than honesty. It didn't, not entirely, because real love is rarely that simple, and the wreckage of 2 years of silence doesn't clear itself in 50 minutes. What actually happened was this. Jack asked me to sit down, gently, his hand hovering near my elbow like he wasn't sure he was still allowed to touch me, and we talked. Really talked, for the first time in 2 years, while somewhere down the hall, a wedding planner grew increasingly frantic, trying to locate her missing groom. I told him everything. The conversation I'd overheard outside his father's study, the months of carrying that fear alone, the small apartment I'd built a life in. The late nights spent wondering if I'd made the right choice, or the most cowardly one. He told me about the months after I left, how he'd searched for me in every way he knew how, until his father intervened. How Harlan had eventually presented him with Celine like a solution to a problem Jack had never agreed was a problem at all. How he'd gone along with the engagement in a kind of numb resignation, because nothing else seemed to matter anymore once he believed he'd lost me. I don't love her, he said, of Celine, his voice low with an old, exhausted guilt. She knows that. She's known it from the start. This wedding was never about love for either of us. It's a business arrangement my father designed, and we both agreed to because neither of us had anything left to fight for. That's not fair to her, I said, because even in the middle of my own unraveling, I couldn't pretend that another person's life and choices weren't real. No, Jack agreed, it isn't. And it's even less fair to ask her to go through with it now, knowing what I know. He stood then, with a kind of resolve settling over his features that I remembered from the early days of our relationship, back when he used to argue with his father over me without flinching. He reached for my hand, careful and questioning, like he needed permission for even this small gesture, and when I let him take it, something in his shoulders loosened like a held breath, finally released. I need to talk to Celine, he said. And then I need to talk to my father. And then, if you'll let me, I need to spend the rest of my life making up for 2 years I should never have let happen. The conversation with Celine, I learned later, took less time than anyone expected. She'd apparently suspected for months that Jack's heart belonged somewhere else entirely, had simply lacked the proof or the courage to address it directly. When Jack found her in the bridal suite, still in the early stages of getting ready, and told her the truth, gently, honestly, with more respect than either of their families had shown either of them throughout this whole arranged mess, she reportedly laughed, relieved, and told him she'd been hoping someone would finally call the whole thing off before she had to be the one to do it. I met Celine myself weeks later at a small cafe neither of our families had any reason to frequent, because she'd asked Jack if she could speak with me directly. And I found I didn't have it in me to refuse a woman who had, in her own way, also survived Harlan Norton's plans for her future. I want you to know I'm not angry, she told me, stirring her coffee slowly, her expression open in a way I hadn't expected. I think some part of me always knew Jack wasn't really mine to keep. He used to say your name in his sleep, you know, the few nights we spent in the same house preparing for all this. I never told him. I figured he'd work it out eventually, one way or another. I'm sorry, I told her, because it felt true even if it wasn't entirely my burden to apologize for. None of this was fair to you, either. No, she agreed with a small, wry smile, but I think I'm walking away from it with considerably more freedom than I would have had married into the Norton family. So perhaps we both got something out of the wreckage. She glanced down at my stomach, her expression softening. Take care of that baby, and take care of him too. He's a good man underneath all that money and pressure. He just needed someone to remind him what mattered. I never forgot her kindness in that conversation, the grace she extended to a situation that could have easily turned bitter and didn't. The conversation with Harlan Norton was considerably louder, and unlike the one with Celine, I was present for at least part of it, standing quietly near the doorway of his study, while Jack faced down a man who had spent 4 decades building an empire on the assumption that his word was final. You will lose everything, Harlan said, his voice low and controlled in the particular way of men who rarely needed to raise their voices to be obeyed. The company, the board's confidence, every connection I have spent your entire life building on your behalf. Is that Omega truly worth all of that to you? His name is Anthony, Jack said, and I watched something settle into his spine, some old fear finally releasing its grip. And yes, he is worth more to me than the company ever was. I should have told you that 2 years ago, instead of letting you believe I might eventually fall in line. You're a fool, Harlan said, though something in his voice had shifted, some certainty cracking at the edges now that his threats weren't landing the way they once had. You'll regret this within a year, once the money runs out and you realize what kind of life you've chosen instead. Maybe, Jack allowed, but it'll be my life, and my regret to carry, instead of a life built entirely around your approval. I'm done asking for that, Father. I spent 2 years miserable, engaged to a woman I didn't love, because I thought eventually you'd come around if I just proved myself loyal enough. I'm not interested in that trade anymore. Harlan's jaw tightened, and for a long, suspended moment, I thought the conversation might end the way I'd always feared it would, with Jack backing down, with old patterns of obedience reasserting themselves the way they always had before. Instead, Jack turned, crossed the room, and took my hand in front of his father, a deliberate, unmistakable choice. This is the life I'm choosing, he said. I'd rather have it with nothing than have everything without it. Harlan didn't soften that day, not entirely, not in any way that felt immediately comforting. But something in the room shifted permanently in that moment. Some balance of power that had always favored fear, suddenly tipping, however slightly, toward something braver. The wedding, of course, did not happen that day. The guests were sent home with confused apologies. The florists packed up their unused arrangements, and the hotel staff spent the rest of the afternoon quietly speculating about what exactly had unfolded behind closed doors in the East Wing. Somewhere in a quiet corner of the hotel garden, the same garden where Jack and I had first stood together 2 years before, he found me waiting still in my plain work uniform, my hands still faintly smelling of shoe polish, and he knelt in front of me with no ring and no plan. Just an apology 2 years overdue. I should have fought harder, he said, his hands resting carefully over mine where they rested on my stomach. I should have made you believe I'd choose you no matter what, he threatened. I'm sorry it took me losing 2 years to prove it. I should have trusted you, I told him, tears finally falling freely, no longer held back by the fear of an audience or the need to seem composed. I should have given you the chance to choose, instead of making that choice for both of us. We both made mistakes, he said, but Anthony, I am choosing you now. I am choosing you and this baby, in front of anyone who wants to watch, for the rest of however long you'll have me. I won't pretend the months that followed were entirely simple. Harlan Norton did not soften overnight, and there were difficult conversations still ahead of us, about family, about money, about what it meant for Jack to step back from a company he'd spent his whole life being groomed to inherit. There were nights we argued, old wounds resurfacing in unexpected moments, 2 years of separate grief that didn't simply dissolve because we'd found our way back to each other. But there were also mornings I woke up to Jack's hand resting protectively over the curve of my stomach, his face soft with a wonder that hadn't existed in him before. Murmuring quiet promises to a child who couldn't understand the words yet, but who I liked to believe could feel the love in them all the same. There were evenings spent slowly, carefully rebuilding trust, learning each other again as the people we'd become rather than the people we used to be. There was a small apartment that gradually filled with 2 lives, merging back into one, and eventually a name for our daughter that we chose together late one night. Neither of us willing to fall asleep until we'd settled on something that felt right. She arrived 4 months after that day in the hotel garden, 3 weeks earlier than the midwife had predicted, on an ordinary evening that turned extraordinary the moment my water broke while Jack was washing dishes in our small kitchen. I remember the particular chaos of those hours, Jack's hands shaking as he tried to remember everything we practiced, the drive to the birthing center that felt simultaneously too fast and unbearably slow. The way he held my hand through every contraction and murmured the same steady words over and over. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I'm here." When they finally placed our daughter in my arms, small and furious and impossibly perfect, I watched Jack's face crumble into an expression I'd never seen on him before, not even in our earliest, most tender moments together. He looked at her like she was the answer to a question he hadn't known he'd been asking his whole life. And then he looked at me with that same expression, and I understood in that exhausted, overwhelmed moment that whatever fear had once driven me away, I would never have to carry alone again. "She has your stubbornness already," he said, voice thick with tears he didn't bother hiding. "Look at her." Furious at the whole world for interrupting her peace. "She has your eyes," I told him, and he leaned down to kiss my forehead, then hers, with a tenderness that undid the last lingering knot of doubt I'd carried for 2 long years. We named her Margaret after no one in particular, simply because we both liked the sound of it, and because Jack said it felt right to choose a name that belonged entirely to her rather than borrowed from a family history weighted down with expectation. Harlan Norton came to see her eventually, some months later, standing stiffly in our small living room with a gift he clearly hadn't known how to choose, looking entirely out of place among our mismatched furniture. He didn't apologize, not in so many words, but he held his granddaughter for a long, silent moment, and something in his rigid posture eased as he looked down at her. And I found I didn't need the apology nearly as much as I'd once imagined I would. Some wounds simply needed time and small gestures to soften, rather than grand confessions, and watching Harlan's careful, unpracticed tenderness with Margaret was its own quiet kind of healing. Rebuilding what we'd lost wasn't a single triumphant moment in a garden, no matter how much that day felt like the turning point our story needed. It was a long, unglamorous process made of smaller moments, some of them difficult, that mattered just as much as the dramatic reunion that started everything. I remember one particular argument, maybe 2 months after Margaret was born, when exhaustion had worn both of us thin and old fears resurfaced in the ugliest possible way. Jack had come home late from a meeting with lawyers sorting through the practical wreckage of stepping back from his father's company, and I'd spent the day alone with a colicky newborn, raw-nerved and exhausted, in a way that made patience feel impossible. "You don't get to disappear for hours and come home expecting everything to be fine," I told him, my voice sharper than I intended, old hurt bleeding into a complaint that wasn't really about the lawyers at all. "I spent 2 years figuring out how to do everything by myself. I don't know how to just hand half of it over and trust you'll actually be here." Jack didn't get defensive, though I half expected him to. He set down his bag, crossed the room, and knelt in front of where I sat with Margaret finally asleep against my chest, his expression open and unguarded. "You're right to be scared of that," he said quietly. "I left you to handle everything alone once, even if I didn't know I was doing it. I understand why some part of you is waiting for me to disappear again. I can't undo that with one apology. I can only keep showing up, every day, until eventually that fear has less evidence to stand on than the 2 years before it did." It wasn't a perfect resolution. We were both still raw, still learning how to trust the version of each other that had emerged from 2 years of separate grief. But it was honest, and it was patient, and slowly over the following months, those small, honest moments accumulated into something sturdier than the relationship we'd lost. Not because the love itself had changed, but because we'd both finally learned how to protect it properly with honesty instead of silence, with partnership instead of unilateral decisions made out of fear. We never went back to the Chamberlain Hotel after that day, not for any particular reason except that neither of us needed to. The story of who we'd been there, the Omega who polished shoes, and the Alpha who almost married someone else, became something we told our daughter years later, softened into the kind of bedtime story parents tell when they want their children to believe that love given enough courage and enough time finds its way home. Margaret is older now, old enough to ask questions about how her parents met, and I have told her a version of this story more times than I can count, each telling a little softer around the edges. a little more forgiving of the fear that drove me away in the first place. Children, I have learned, want their parents' love stories to be simple, and so I give her the simple version, that her father and I loved each other very much, that we got separated by circumstances neither of us could control, and that we found our way back to each other because love like ours doesn't give up easily, even when everything else seems determined to pull it apart. The truer, more complicated version lives in me still in quieter moments. Late at night sometimes, when Jack is asleep beside me and Margaret is finally settled in her own room down the hall, I find myself returning to that hallway outside the groom's suite to the look on Jack's face when he understood what my hand resting over my stomach meant. I think about how close we came to losing each other permanently, how easily an entire life might have unfolded differently if I'd simply chosen to avoid that hallway. If I'd asked to leave early the way some instinct had urged me to. If Jack's wedding had proceeded the way his father intended, and I'd gone home that evening to raise our daughter alone, never knowing whether love might have found its way back to us if only I'd given it the chance. I don't regret the fear that drove my choices, not entirely because that fear came from somewhere real, from watching Jack struggle against his father for months without ever quite winning, from understanding exactly how much power and money a family like the Nortons could wield against someone like me. But I have learned, in the years since, that fear makes a poor architect for a life. It builds walls instead of homes, distance instead of safety, and the things it protects you from are rarely worth what it costs you to build those walls in the first place. Jack still keeps that old pair of shoes, the ones I polished without knowing they were his, the ones with the scuff on the left toe that gave away 2 years of careful distance in a single recognized detail. He had them resoled eventually, just as he'd always planned, refusing every suggestion that he simply replace them with something new. They sit in the back of our closet now, worn but cared for, a small physical reminder of the day everything nearly fell apart and somehow, instead, came back together. Sometimes when I'm cleaning, I find them tucked in their usual corner, and I run my thumb along that familiar scuff mark, remembering the particular ache of polishing a stranger's wedding shoes, only to discover, with my hands already smelling of leather and wax, that the stranger was the only man I'd ever truly loved. I think about the version of myself who sat in that small hotel room with Jack's shoes in his lap, certain he would walk past me into a marriage that wasn't his to want, never to look back. I'm grateful, more than I have words for, that he looked back. I'm grateful he saw me standing there, hand resting over the life we'd made together without either of us planning it, and chose, fully, finally, without his father's voice in his head or mine, to choose us. Some loves survive distance. Some loves survive fear. Ours, somehow, survived both, polished bright in a hallway neither of us expected to find each other in, shining the way only something cared for, even in silence, even from a distance, can shine. We built our life slowly, deliberately out of the wreckage of everything that almost didn't happen. A small house, eventually though, not the one with the blue shutters Jack had once imagined. A dog we argued over for weeks before finally agreeing on a scruffy, affectionate mutt neither of us could resist once we met him. Ordinary dinners that we no longer took for granted, knowing exactly how close we'd come to never sharing them at all. Margaret grew alongside our rebuilt trust, watching her parents learn, slowly and imperfectly, how to love each other without the silence and fear that had once nearly cost us everything. Harlan Norton softened further as the years passed in the particular way stubborn men sometimes do once grandchildren enter the equation, his rigid certainty about legacy and money slowly giving way to a quieter, more genuine affection that none of us had expected from him. He never fully apologized for the threats he'd once made, not in words, but he showed up, consistently, at birthday parties and school recitals, and eventually that consistency became its own kind of apology, imperfect but sincere. Jack left the shipping company entirely within the first year, choosing instead to build something smaller and entirely his own, a modest consulting business that let him use his sharp mind without the crushing weight of his father's expectations attached to every decision. He told me once late at night that walking away from the Norton legacy was the easiest difficult decision he'd ever made because for the first time in his life, the thing he was choosing instead felt more like freedom than sacrifice. As for me, I left the Chamberlain not long after Margaret was born, trading shoe polish and quiet anonymity for a slower, fuller life centered around the family I'd once feared I would have to build entirely alone. I think of that small room sometimes, the narrow closet beside the lobby where I spent so many months hiding from a past I thought I'd never have to face again. I'm not angry at the version of myself who worked there, who polished strangers' shoes with such careful, deliberate focus that the work became a kind of meditation against grief. That version of me survived something difficult with more grace than I sometimes give him credit for, and he deserves, I think, a little more compassion than I've always been willing to extend. We are, all of us, just trying to survive our circumstances with whatever tools we have available. Mine, for 2 years, were patience and shoe polish and a fierce, protective love for a child I hadn't even met yet. Jack's were a stubborn hope that refused to fully die, even when every practical sign suggested he should let it. Together, eventually, those tools proved sufficient to rebuild something neither of us had quite believed was still possible. If you had told me, on that ordinary morning when the brass bell rang an 8th time just for me, that by evening my entire life would be unrecognizable, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have told you that some loves are simply lost, that 2 years of silence and fear had surely buried whatever Jack and I once shared too deeply to ever properly excavate again. I would have been wrong, gratefully, completely wrong, in the way that only the best surprises in life manage to be. I polished his shoes that morning without knowing whose wedding I was preparing him for. By evening, I understood that I had spent the day without realizing it, polishing my way back into a life I thought I'd lost forever, one careful, deliberate stroke at a time, until everything between us gleamed bright enough to see clearly again. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.